In 2005, a group of executives walked into a boardroom at Merrill Lynch and offered to make the most dangerous wager in the history of the entertainment industry. They were representing a company that had recently clawed its way out of a brutal, humiliating bankruptcy. They had no studio. They had no distribution network. They had no real experience making major motion pictures. And they wanted $525 million. But that is not the shocking part. The shocking part is what they offered as collateral. To secure the loan, this company literally bet the legal rights to their 10 remaining top-tier intellectual properties. They put the Avengers, Captain America, Black Panther, and Ant-Man on the chopping block. It was a bloodbath waiting to happen. If their very first independently produced movie failed at the box office, they would default on the loan. The bank would instantly seize the characters. The company would lose the core of its universe forever, effectively erasing its future. They were betting their absolute survival on a B-list superhero, directed by an indie filmmaker, starring an actor who was considered entirely uninsurable by Hollywood standards. It was corporate suicide. Or so everyone thought. Instead, it triggered a multi-billion-dollar empire. It completely redefined the geometry of modern cinema. But the actual mechanism behind this triumph isn't just about making a good movie. It is a brilliant, hidden business framework regarding intellectual property leverage, vertical integration, and risk asymmetry. We are going to reveal exactly what that framework is and how it transformed the industry a little later in this breakdown. First, we need to examine the wreckage. We need to look at the absolute financial devastation that forced them to make this desperate gamble in the first place. So how did Marvel Entertainment go from a bankrupt comic book publisher, selling off its most iconic characters for absolute pennies, to an unstoppable studio that Disney bought for $4 billion? That is the exact question we are answering today. To understand the genius of the turnaround, you must first understand the depth of the failure. Let's go back to 1996. Marvel was not a titan of pop culture. It was a toxic, bleeding casualty of corporate greed. During the late 1980s and early 90s, the comic book industry experienced a massive, artificial boom. It was a speculator market. Fans weren't just buying comics to read them. They were buying multiple copies of variant covers, holographic editions, and foil-stamped number ones, treating them like finite financial assets. They thought they were buying the next Action Comics number one. They were wronged. It was a bubble. At the helm of Marvel during this time was a billionaire financier named Ron Perelman. He saw this massive spike in revenue and decided to squeeze the company for every possible drop of cash. He didn't just publish more comics. He went on a massive acquisition spree. He bought trading card companies. He bought sticker companies. He bought toy distributors. And he financed all of this expansion by loading Marvel up with hundreds of millions of dollars in high-yield junk bonds. It was a classic leveraged buyout strategy built on the assumption that the comic book bubble would never burst. Then the bubble burst. Hard. The speculators realized their foil-stamped comics were actually mass-produced and essentially worthless. Sales completely plummeted. The entire industry collapsed inward. Suddenly, Marvel's revenue could not even cover the interest payments on Perelman's massive debt. It was a catastrophe. In late 1996, Marvel officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The company that had birthed Spider-Man, the X-Men, and the Fantastic Four was reduced to a financial war zone. Billionaires like Carl Icahn fought bitterly in bankruptcy court over the scraps. Eventually, a company called Toy Biz, run by Ike Perlmutter and Avi Arad, managed to seize control of Marvel. They merged Toy Biz with Marvel to bring the company out of bankruptcy in 1998. They had survived the immediate threat of death. But survival is not profitability. Marvel was still desperately cash poor. They looked at their massive library of over 4,000 characters. They realized they were sitting on a goldmine of intellectual property, but they had absolutely no capital to monetize it. So they did what desperate companies do. They rented out their assets. This began the licensing era. It was a period of intense frustration and agonizing financial reality. Marvel executives, led by Avi Arad, went to major Hollywood studios and practically begged them to make movies based on Marvel characters. The pitch was simple. Marvel would give the studio the rights to the character. The studio would take all the financial risk to produce, market, and distribute the film. In exchange, Marvel would take a tiny, microscopic cut of the box office revenue, but they would keep the rights to sell the toys. At the time, this seemed like the only logical move. It was risk-free revenue. In 1998, New Line Cinema released Blade. It was a massive hit, grossing over $130 million worldwide. It proved that Marvel characters could work on the big screen. But Marvel's take from that massive box office? A reported $25,000. Read that number again. $25,000 on a $130 million hit. The pain only compounded. In 2000, 20th Century Fox released X-Men. It grossed nearly $300 million. It revitalized the entire superhero genre. Marvel saw only a tiny fraction of that money. Then came the ultimate insult. In 2002, Sony Pictures released Spider-Man. It was a cultural phenomenon. It shattered box office records, bringing in over $820 million globally. Sony executives were swimming in cash. They were building franchises. They were generating massive institutional equity. Marvel, the creator of the character, the owner of the underlying intellectual property, walked away with a few $1,000,000 from a movie that generated nearly $1 billion. This is the dip in the J-curve. This is the moment of maximum friction. Marvel had successfully proven that their intellectual property was the most valuable commodity in Hollywood. But because of their business model, they were locked out of the actual wealth creation. They were acting as a landlord, collecting a meager rent, while the tenants built massive, profitable skyscrapers on their land. They realized a terrifying truth. Licensing is a loser's game. When you license your core product, you cap your upside while surrendering control. If a studio makes a terrible movie, it damages the Marvel brand, and Marvel can't stop them. If a studio makes a brilliant movie, the studio reaps 95% of the financial reward. Marvel was stuck in a stagnant, low-margin existence. They needed a paradigm shift. Enter a young, ambitious executive named David Maisel. Maisel looked at Marvel's balance sheet and saw a tragedy. He understood a fundamental rule of business. If you want to capture the value of your assets, you cannot outsource the execution. You have to own the entire pipeline. He went to the head of Marvel, Ike Perlmutter, with a radical, terrifying proposal. Marvel must stop licensing its characters to other studios. Period. Marvel must build its own independent film studio. Marvel must finance its own movies, hire its own directors, and control its own creative destiny. Perlmutter was famously frugal. The idea of spending hundreds of millions of dollars to make movies terrified him. What if the movie bombs? The company would be thrown right back into bankruptcy. The risk was unfathomable. But Maisel had a financial structure that could bypass Perlmutter's fears. He wasn't going to use Marvel's operating cash. He was going to use Wall Street. This brings us back to the fateful boardroom in 2005. Maisel, alongside executives like Kevin Feige, constructed a financing vehicle known as a non-recourse debt facility. They went to Merrill Lynch and pitched a massive slate financing deal. They asked for $525 million to fund up to 10 films. The genius of the non-recourse structure is that if the movies failed, the bank could not come after Marvel's corporate assets or its comic book publishing business. Marvel Entertainment, the parent company, was insulated from the financial risk. But Wall Street does not give away $500 million for free. They needed collateral. Since Marvel had already licensed away their A-list heroes, Spider-Man to Sony, X-Men and Fantastic Four to Fox, they had to use what was left. They put up the film rights to 10 specific characters: Captain America, the Avengers, Nick Fury, Black Panther, Ant-Man, Cloak Dagger, Doctor Strange, Hawkeye, Power Pack, Shanghai. It was the ultimate gamble. If the studio failed, those characters belonged to the bank. Marvel would be completely hollowed out. They would be a comic company with no Avengers. Merrill Lynch agreed. The deal was struck. Marvel Studios was officially born. But having the money was only the first step. Now they actually had to execute. And their starting position was incredibly weak. The general public did not care about Iron Man. To the average moviegoer in 2006, Iron Man was a C-list character. He wasn't Batman. He wasn't Spider-Man. He was a guy in a metal suit. To lead this monumental task, Marvel leaned on Kevin Feige, a young producer with an encyclopedic knowledge of the comic lore. Feige understood something that the other Hollywood studios fundamentally missed. Other studios treated superhero movies as generic action films. Feige treated the source material as sacred text. He didn't want to make a movie that apologized for being a comic book. He wanted to embrace the sincerity of the characters. But to do that, they needed to make creative choices that terrified traditional Hollywood executives. First, they hired Jon Favreau to direct. Favreau was known for indie comedies like Swingers and the holiday hit Elf. He was not a massive action blockbuster director. But Feige and Arid saw that Favreau understood character chemistry and tone. Then came the casting. This was the most contentious decision in the history of the studio. Favreau wanted Robert Downey Jr. to play Tony Stark. At the time, Downey was considered Hollywood poison. His struggles with addiction and the law were highly publicized. Major studios simply refused to hire him for massive tentpole franchises because insurance companies charged exorbitant premiums to cover him. He was deemed too risque. Marvel executives fought Favreau. They wanted a safer bet. They wanted a traditional leading man. But Favreau held his ground. He argued that the redemption arc of Tony Stark perfectly mirrored the real-life redemption arc of Robert Downey Jr. The audience wouldn't just be watching a character. They would be feeling the weight of the actor's actual life. It was the second massive gamble. First, they bet the intellectual property. Now they bet the entire execution on an uninsurable actor. Production began, and it was pure chaos. They were building the airplane while they were flying it. They had a massive budget, but an incomplete script. Favreau and Downey were literally improvising dialogue on set. They were relying on their deep understanding of the character to guide the narrative in real time. It was terrifying. The pressure was immense. If Iron Man bombed, there would be no Captain America movie. There would be no Thor. The bank would swoop in, seize the assets, and the great Marvel experiment would be dead on arrival. In May 2008, Iron Man hit theaters. The result was instantaneous. It wasn't just a hit. It was a cultural earthquake. The film grossed over $585 million worldwide. Critics praised its tone, its action, and overwhelmingly, the undeniable charisma of Robert Downey Jr. But the true genius of Marvel's strategy wasn't revealed during the runtime of the film. It was revealed after the credits rolled. In a brief post-credits scene, Samuel L. Jackson appeared as Nick Fury. He looked at Tony Stark and said the words that would change the entertainment industry forever. "You've become part of a bigger universe. You just don't know it yet." He mentioned the Avenger initiative. The audience in the theater lost their minds. This had never been done before in modern cinema. And this is the core insight. This is the true, hidden strategy that turned Marvel from a bankrupt licensing company into the most dominant force in Hollywood. This brings us to the aha moment. Marvel did not just transition from licensing to production. They didn't just decide to make their own movies. That alone would have been a great business move, allowing them to capture the full margin of a film's profit. The real secret is that Marvel invented a completely new geometric model for customer acquisition. They built an interlocking, vertically integrated cinematic ecosystem. Before Marvel, sequels were linear. You made Batman 1, then Batman 2, then Batman 3. If a viewer missed Batman 1, they were less likely to watch Batman 2. Each subsequent film had to spend massive amounts of marketing dollars to reacquire the audience. Marvel destroyed this linear model. They built a matrix. By introducing the concept of a shared universe, every single Marvel movie became a billion-dollar advertisement for the next Marvel movie. When you went to see Iron Man 2, you were introduced to Black Widow. If you wanted to see the payoff to Black Widow's storyline, you had to buy a ticket to the Avengers. When you watched Thor, you were introduced to Hawkeye. The characters cross-pollinated. The storylines intertwined. This fundamentally altered the economics of blockbuster filmmaking. In a traditional studio, the customer acquisition cost, the marketing spend required to get a viewer into a theater seat, is astronomical for every new original franchise. But Marvel drove their customer acquisition cost into the floor. Because of the interconnected universe, the audience developed a profound fear of missing out. You couldn't just skip the Captain America movie, because if you did, you wouldn't understand the plot of the next Avengers movie. They effectively turned standalone, 2-hour movies into highly serialized, massive-budget television episodes. They conditioned the global audience to view every single release as mandatory viewing. This is why, just a few years later, Marvel could release a movie starring a talking raccoon and a walking tree, Guardians of the Galaxy, and make nearly $800 million. The brand itself had become the draw. The trust in the interconnected universe was absolute. They had taken their biggest weakness, the fact that they only had B-list characters left, and turned it into their greatest strength. They proved that the IP wasn't just the individual hero. The IP was the Marvel Universe itself. By taking the ultimate risk with Merrill Lynch, they reclaimed ownership of their destiny. By vertically integrating, they captured 100% of the upside. And by building a serialized matrix, they created a financial flywheel that competitors spent the next decade desperately and fruitlessly trying to copy. In 2009, observing this incredible machine, the Walt Disney Company stepped in and purchased Marvel Entertainment for $4 billion. It is now considered one of the greatest corporate acquisitions in the history of business. But managing a transition of this magnitude, from a chaotic, bankrupt comic publisher to a highly synchronized, interconnected film studio, requires absolute organizational perfection. When Kevin Feige and his team were building Phase 1 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, their biggest existential threat wasn't a bad script. It was logistical collapse. They had to align financing, casting, visual effects, and marketing across 4 different movie productions simultaneously, all while ensuring the interconnected storylines matched up perfectly. If the timeline in Incredible Hulk contradicted the timeline in Iron Man 2, the illusion of the shared universe would shatter. When you're scaling a massive, complex project, whether it's a cinematic universe or a new SaaS product, operational chaos is the enemy of execution. You cannot build an empire if your data is scattered across 50 different spreadsheets, your team is communicating in siloed email chains, and your overarching strategy is lost in the noise. That is exactly why modern, high-growth teams rely on Mondaycom. Mondaycom is the ultimate work OS that allows you to manage incredibly complex, interconnected projects with absolute clarity. Instead of letting your teams operate in the dark, Mondaycom centralizes your entire workflow into highly visual, customizable dashboards. If you're trying to pull off your own organizational turnaround, you need a system that gives you the 10,000-foot strategic view while letting you manage the micro details of execution. Mondaycom allows you to automate repetitive tasks, align cross-functional teams, and ensure that every single moving piece of your business is moving in the exact same direction. It is the operational command center you need to build your own integrated empire. You can start organizing your most complex projects right now by clicking the link in the description to try Mondaycom for free. The Marvel turnaround is not a story about superheroes. It is a story about leverage. It is the definitive proof that renting out your core assets will keep you alive, but it will never make you rich. If you want to build truly generational wealth and brand equity, you have to be willing to take calculated, terrifying risks to own your upside. Marvel bet the farm. They put their very existence on the line. But they didn't do it blindly. They did it with a meticulously planned strategy to reshape the entire landscape of their industry. They stopped playing the licensing game, built a matrix of infinite marketing leverage, and won the universe. If you learned something new, hit the like button and subscribe for more strategy breakdowns. And let us know in the comments, what company's strategy should we unlock next?